Well, welcome back, everyone. We had a great start to our morning together, and I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Katherine Karam McCray, who is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto. And Katherine's paper will be Balthasar's Spiritual Senses and the Overlooked Disabled Body. It will be followed by a response from Dr. Eric Mabry, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Systematic Theology at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, Maryland. So thank you very much, Katherine.
Hi, everyone. I am so appreciative for the invitation to be a part of this important discussion, and I'm very appreciative that you're allowing me to interject some Balthasar into your conversation of Lonergan. I hope my topic will contribute something meaningful to the overall conversation by calling us to question what we believe traditional anthropology in the Christian church constitutes. The concept of spiritual senses in Christianity is antique, most well known through Origen, Pseudo-Dionysius, and Maximus the Confessor. However, Hans Urs von Balthasar, while resourcing ancient tradition, configures his spiritual senses in such a way as to counter what he sees as the persistence of Neoplatonic dualism in modern Christian thought. In volume 1 of his Aesthetics, Seeing the Form, Balthasar describes the, quote, breakup of the soul and its body, disembodied theologies that prioritize the world of the mind over face-to-face encounter. The beauty of the human-divine encounter, quote, lies not in a disembodied spirit which looks about for a field of expression, end quote, and neither, quote, is it a spiritless body which somehow throws itself together through an inexplicable play of material forces. The body and soul are in partnership for Balthasar, clearly drawing from Maximus's own language of spiritual and material composite. The human being is defined by this composite nature, the unity of body and soul. Regarding Platonic forms, Balthasar highlights the disunity between soul and body when the spiritual or noetic is seen as wholly separate, and thus derivative with the body deriving from the activity or the searching of the soul. Here, Balthasar sort of cheekily suggests that such a detached view of the body's meaning begets scientific disregard for the body, describing Plato as, quote, the father of all those who adopt a wholly superfluous and only apparently scientific attitude in order to investigate psychologically how the soul can break free out of its interiority and enter the so-called exterior world. Balthasar's commitment to the material body is revolutionary in a theological context which often frames spiritual senses as eclipsing physical senses. Mark McCray describes the reorientation of spiritual sense as a shift toward personalist anthropology, describing the ways in which Balthasar interacts with these inherited frameworks from Bonaventure and others. By grounding them in ordinary life, he subverts and materializes them. McCray explains, quote, Balthasar interweaves spiritual and corporeal perception with each other such that the spiritual perceiving cannot occur without its bodily counterpart. So also, whereas the spiritual senses have traditionally been interpreted as pertaining to mystical encounter with God, reserved for a few, Balthasar repositions the doctrine so that the spiritual senses are granted to all Christians amongst the general gifts of grace, end quote. So significant is this ordinariness of the spiritual senses that Balthasar indicts a long list of scholars, some medieval and some contemporary, as having reserved the sensate mystical experience for only the monastic elite. In contrast to a strain of mysticism which served as goals for ordained life, he views this project as reviving a more ancient, more accessible model, explaining that his definitions of the sensate body revive a type of mystical, quote, mystical experience that at the time, speaking of Christian history, was still viewed as the particular unfolding of the general and, so to speak, normal experience of the Christian who is seriously seeking to live his faith, end quote. Balthasar's spiritual senses, then, are not the achievement of a religious elite, but instead serve as the sign of faith for everyday life, aligned with the gifts of grace, achievable by every Christian. He explains, quote, "In his love for his neighbor, the Christian definitively receives his Christian or spiritual senses, which of course are none other than his bodily senses, but these insofar as they have been formed according to the true form of Christ. Here, the degree to which the senses cohere with the form of Christ is crucial, performative, and identifying. The body is the site for both divine and human encounter. So physical senses are tangibly interrelated with spiritual senses and knowledge and perception of God." McCray clarifies, quote, "For Balthasar, then this is actually the corporeal senses themselves that become spiritual. The spiritual senses grow out of the bodily senses. There is therefore no parallel set of spiritual senses or faculties that must be brought together with the corporeal senses. Instead, the spiritual senses are transformed versions of the ordinary perceptual faculties of the body." When Balthasar theorizes his model for spiritual senses, he operates within a layered respect for Christian history, pulling threads from patristic, scholastic, and modern sources, synthesizing them with the decisive hand of an artist. But I will argue that when it comes to his world of sensate materiality, Balthasar leaves important themes on the cutting floor. What results is an account of spiritual encounter that overlooks disability entirely, neglecting to account for how a lack of physical sense might impact the acquisition of the spiritual senses or correspondingly derail an individual's knowledge and pursuit of God. By connecting the spiritual senses to the physical senses in a one-to-one correspondence, where spiritual sight is intimately attached to physical sight, spiritual hearing is also connected to physical hearing, etc., the implications for disabled persons might result in diminished or restricted encounter with God, because Balthasar additionally connects spiritual senses with physical senses with spiritual senses in the process of salvation and sanctification. He then implicates these requisite physical senses in that process. By overlooking disability, Balthasar's senses speak only to a certain type of body, a body described by stable senses and abilities, a body that is not contingent, subject to decay, age, disease, injury, and certainly not bodies born with congenital differences. Balthasar's positive regard for materialism could present a large opportunity for disability theologies because, unlike other historically denigrating stances toward flesh, Balthasar's spiritual senses are linked in a non-transient way to physical senses. The physical body matters. This attitude toward the body means that in terms of eschatology, Balthasar does not represent an attitude that replaces matter with new perfected bodies, or specifically non-disabled spiritual bodies. He explicitly underscores that the transfigured body is one and the same with Christ's material body, and that the spiritual senses transform but do not obliterate physical senses. However, despite this high view of integrated sensate in the divine encounter, one key flaw precludes utilizing Balthasar's spiritual senses as a model for disability inclusive thought, and that is normative stereotyping. I will discuss how Balthasar, by overlooking the disabled body entirely, collapses his archetypical senses into normate standards. I will then explain the impact of those normative standards on his expectation of knowledge acquisition through spiritual senses. And really that I imagine that category to be much more fleshed out in the written version of this, but we'll just touch on that as an implication. By speaking about bodies with organizational standards that exclude physical variation, Balthasar imagines a moral subject with a stable, non-contingent, non-variable body, a standard which resists the affection he has for the real bodies, real senses, and real encounter. Finally, I recommend an alteration to Balthasar's conception of knowledge and glory that pulls, in my belief, from a patristic bedrock, which he already utilizes and invites an alternative configuration of participation and distributed knowledge. Disability scholars often position their work as responding to a historically embedded bias against bodily difference. Natural law paradigms, which present the functional capacities of bodies as proofs of God's sovereignty, position the disabled body to be correspondingly unmanaged, what Fiona Kamari Campbell calls the unruly, uncivilized disabled body. Where human nature is shaped as naturally governed by a will, where autonomy and unrestricted agency are automatic and congenital, the disabled body represents a failure to manage one's own internal monarchy and to protect one's own borders. Kamari Campbell further explains the political territory of the disabled body as an unthinkable object in relation to a civil society that establishes able-only norms as essential to human nature. By contrast, disability becomes what David Mitchell describes as recalcitrant corporeal matter, where the disabled body refuses to adhere to an essential human nature that overlooks it. Disability represents not only sin, but an active betrayal of truth. Balthasar routinely speaks of blindness and deafness as obstinacy, as a continued stance of the will. On the one hand, we could be tempted to excuse these analogies as rhetorical, but elsewhere, Balthasar emphasizes the realness of the senses in question, their real substance and real meaning. So for him to even symbolically instrumentalize deafness or blindness without having real bodies in mind represents more than an oversight. If Balthasar's senses are real senses belonging to real bodies, deafness as a willful ignorance and blindness as refusal of God emphasizes discrimination inherent within a normate standard that he employs. The term normate was first used by Rosemarie Garland Thompson in the late 90s as what she calls a, quote, deliberately clunky neologism that calls attention to itself by mocking the clinical. Normate, she says, is the constructed identity of those who, by way of bodily configurations and cultural capital, the cultural capital that they assume, can step into a position of authority and wield power, which wield the power which it grants them. As she continues, the word normate fills the critical need to name a heretofore under, if not untheorized, position. The work of this deliberately awkward term, she says, is to defamiliarize the privileged designation of able-bodied, shifting it out of the body and into the realm of social and political relations. Where Balthasar speaks about the senses and assumes a certain natural organization conferred by youth, genetics, access to shelter, food, clean water, political security, etc., he speaks with the authority conferred by a normate political system. The spiritual senses function as aspects of physical senses. So with those senses classified as 5 and positioned as necessary, what I'm arguing here is that there's a normate operational standard. The one-to-one relationship with the physical senses and spiritual senses might indicate that a lack of sense renders the person unable to access the type of knowledge conferred by both the physical and spiritual sense. If spiritual sight is dependent on physical sight, is the person born with congenital blindness unable to see God? Or the person with macular degeneration who loses sight over time? Are they limited in their spiritual sight as their physical sense degrades? Garland Thompson's analysis of operational normates emphasizes the mythic adherence we display to a category, normal, which is actually quite rare in the wild. She cites Goffman with humor, explaining that this archetypical normal is, quote, the only one complete blushing male in America, a young, married, white, urban, northern, heterosexual, Protestant, father of college education, fully employed, of good complexion, weight, and height, with a recent record in sports. Garland Thompson continues with the same humor. The ironic point in this description is that the prototypical figure of normalcy is not what we actually see everywhere, but rather is what we expect to see. The illusion of the normal is often what people reach for in creating self-presentations, particularly those in the public eye, such as politicians, executives, or news anchors, for example. This phantom figure of the normate is the veiled subject position of the cultural self, the figure outlined by the array of deviant others whose marked bodies shore up the normate's boundaries. Actual normates are as scarce as hen's teeth, whereas imagined normates preside over the public landscape. So while the abominations that life makes of so many of us are always amongst us, their presence is a perpetual surprise. In this way, normate standards form a type of hegemony, restricting our anthropologies and setting up social, legal, and theological expectations that do not actually derive from or cohere with what we can perceive about the variability of human experience. So routine is the Western Christian model of the individual actor, comprised of autonomy, agency, and an unconstrained will, that suggesting human nature might be otherwise registers at the very least as surprising. However, I would argue that the traditions of vulnerability and dependent human nature are at the heart of Balthasar's interests, even if he himself does not articulate them as such. By pulling from Eastern Christian sources, Balthasar destabilized the concept of stable independent bodies, or through Maximus, he at least introduces a back door to dependent ontologies. That theological anthropologies which articulate human nature are dependent, these exist, and that Balthasar is aware of their difference makes his choices to adhere to normate stereotypes all the more jarring. Where physical blindness often represents dependency on others or even increased spiritual sight in Maximus, Balthasar exclusively conceives of blindness in terms of spiritual lack. Indeed, borrowing from Aquinas, Balthasar reiterates that the human outward form imitates the inward form, concluding that, quote, one which must precede all those particular modalities which are related to man's concrete condition, his sinful turning away from God, his blindness and his obstinacy, and finally, those things which grace works in him, his conversion, his breaking, his humbling, his exaltation. This is a confusing synthesis of ideas when seen through a disability positive lens. How does the inward form manifest the outward concrete condition if bodies themselves are fragile, contingent, and dependent on exterior factors and resources? Why should there be a relationship between a person's inward merit and spiritual dedication and their outward form? Balthasar's obligation to the normate body here compels his reading of disability as a lack, meaning that his attachment between physical and spiritual senses restricts him from being able to imagine a morally neutral reading of bodily difference. He relates blindness, deafness, and muteness to an inability to, quote, perceive the glory of Israel, lacking faith and, quote, the courage to believe. Where previously Balthasar is adamant that the physical cannot be detached or subsumed by the spiritual, and that turning the physical senses into mere symbol or allegory is a feature of Neoplatonism, when it comes to physical inability, these represent only a metaphorical space from which to speak about spiritual lack. Correspondingly, Balthasar discusses at length the possibility of self-blinding and personal complicity with both blindness and deafness. This inconsistency affirms the normativity of sight, hearing, and speech in their material and spiritual value, but links their absence to only a spiritual meaning, that is, sin. Where physical senses should not be reduced to mere metaphor, their corresponding lack serves exclusively as a metaphor, not only affirming the normate standard, but further aligning disability with a compromised relationship with God. However, by unveiling the normate, we lay bare the hypocrisy contained in essentialist definitions of human nature. The expectation of stable bodies as signs of virtue contradicts what is evident in real being, to borrow from Balthasar, where our real bodies and real senses perceive a humanity defined by contingency, dependency, and a variety of physical states. Our commitment to the mythic normate body with normate senses indicates a refusal to encounter God in our beingness. However, by overlooking the fragility and contingency of human bodies, where Balthasar discusses form, particularly the relationship between Christ as the archetypical body and the human body made in the divine image, the normate expectation fundamentally contaminates his language with achievement-oriented, performative standards for earning love-worthy status. And here I quote from Balthasar. The image of existence is here illuminated by the archetype of Christ, and set to work by the free might of the creator spirit, with all the sovereignty of one who need not destroy the natural order to achieve his supernatural goal. For this reason, however, it is clear that in any age, and most especially in our own, the Christian will realize his mission only if he truly becomes, emphasis his, this form, which has been willed and instituted by Christ. The exterior of this form must express and reflect its interior to the world in a credible manner, and the interior must be confirmed, justified, and made love-worthy in its radiant beauty through the truth of the exterior that manifests it. When it is achieved, Christian form is the most beautiful thing that may be found in the human realm. The normate expectation here alters Balthasar's description of transformation. If the body being treated as natural and attainable is in reality unattainable, when Balthasar pronounces that, quote, the exterior of this form must express its interior to the world in a credible manner, end quote, and then in doing so be made love-worthy, the beauty he seeks to instantiate actually discriminates against certain forms as unworthy. Balthasar's use of archetype or build emphasizes the natural expectations of the body and its capacities, both physical and cognitive. In describing the mechanisms of artistic creation, he explains that the artist gives form to the, quote, inner fullness, and education, both artistic and linguistic, quote, does not come about through amassing of materials. It is a growing process being informed by the primal form of the archetype or urbild itself, end quote. Here, urbild is being used to indicate not only the ideal imaginary form, but it is also used functionally as an artist's model or archetype. The urbild is the original image from which a reproduction through artistic representation is made. Disability scholars often describe the othering of non-normate bodies facilitated through the guise of beauty and art. Nancy Easland, in her groundbreaking work, The Disabled God, introduces a case study to portray the dynamism of disabled aesthetics. Diane DeVries, a Texan born in the 1950s with limb differences, encountered many instances of public disgust and restriction, often being asked to stay out of sight. She recalls that in a restaurant, for example, she was moved to a less visible location for fear that her body would revolt customers and, quote, make people sick. Easland marvels at DeVries's fortitude, who, encountering manifold experiences of discrimination, retained a positive perspective of her own beauty. Easland recounts, quote, during young childhood, she became aware of her physical resemblance to the famous Venus de Milo. In the Venus de Milo, whose beauty was apparent not in spite of, but precisely because of her unconventional body, DeVries presented her body as attractive, whole, integrated, claiming an empowering image that reinforces her self-understanding, end quote. Here, DeVries' intimate connection with the Venus de Milo highlights the possibility of disabled aesthetics, even in spaces traditionally dominated by normate stereotypes. When Balthasar anticipates the normate body in his spiritual senses, he uses that sensory configuration as the basis for his aesthetics, casting the human form with normate expectations and connecting that standard to how human beings incarnate Christ. However, beauty and glory is not constrained by normate expectations, because disability in the human population persists, and persons with disabilities resist the collapse of their self-perception into paradigms that devalue and undermine their importance. DeVries' own self-understanding derives from her own embodiment, and her knowledge of beauty derives from that particularity. Seeing herself as divinely crafted, provides the starting place for what she knows, perceives, and proclaims to be beautiful. A disability positive critique of Balthasar's senses is then, by his own structures, a disability critique of how revelation, knowledge, and glory as beauty interact. Without the normate standard establishing what bodies should be in a performative sense, a disability aesthetic looks at what it is, the persistent beingness of disability, and from the being of disabled bodies extrapolates beauty and meaning. The Venus de Milo also serves as a central trope for beauty and inclusion for Tobin Sieber's account of disability aesthetics as a formal philosophical model. The Venus inspired a range of artists to imagine images of the broken body reinterpreted, investing meaning not in her former wholeness, but in the beauty of her contingency. Siebers traces several women's artistic production that reconfigures the meaning of beauty after cancer, amputation, and a wide range of congenital differences, with the central theme being that the fragility and variability of the body is what makes it beautiful. Certainly, we can imagine a similar interpretation of beauty and embodiment in Balthasar's regard for glory. If the spiritual senses are not operationally attached to normate stereotypes, and work not in a one-to-one relationship with individual physical senses, but instead within the collective sensate body, his articulation of spiritual senses could welcome a more variable aesthetic theory. Without destabilizing the normate stereotypes in Balthasar's senses, I believe it renders his account of encounter, both with one another and with the divine, incoherent. In what bodies in what bodies do these encounters occur, who is invited into the encounter, and with a view to the instability and provisional nature of the senses and physical capacities, does that encounter change or diminish if our sensate world shifts? And it is precisely the orientation toward encounter that makes human beings both beautiful and progressively more glorified. So the normate structure of his spiritual senses threatens to compromise the core of his work. However, by critiquing performative normate standards in Balthasar, the structure of his spiritual senses can open up theological possibilities for discussing the ontological and epistemological value of disabled experiences. That Balthasar resents the Neoplatonic denigration of the body and firmly underscores the non-provisional nature of the physical body means his articulation of the senses and the spiritual serve as important counters to Christian eschatologies, which would imagine the perfected or transfigured body as replacements for physical disability. Indeed, Balthasar could offer meaningful critique of dualistic anthropologies today. Theologies which revolve around the transient importance of physical bodies, often disproportionately imagining perfected bodies for persons with disabilities, imagine the heavenly world to eliminate disability. They eliminate disability, difference, and diversity under the guise of this perfection. Because Balthasar's starting point for the spiritual body is the material body, his framework for aesthetics and glorification could offer vital structures to the conversations of body, disability, identity, and extended states of dependency. Perhaps, most importantly, if we are to take Balthasar's spiritual senses seriously, they derive from real bodies, real material, rather than purely theoretical spaces. If this is the case, the stakes for his anthropology are high. If his anthropology manifests as only partially embodied, as existing only within provisional states like ability that fluctuate, change, and disappear with age, then his claim of upending Neoplatonism by centering on real bodies at the heart of his ordinary spiritual encounter ultimately does not only overlook disabled bodies, but overlooks the vulnerable and dependent nature of all bodies. However, by critiquing the normate structures embedded in his work, this anthropology becomes more cogent and the meaning of sensate experiences more inclusive. If his goal is to locate the mystical within the everyday movement of our material bodies, affirming the realness of contingency augments Balthasar's revolutionary claim that the material body and the spiritual body are one in the same. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katherine. I'll turn it over to Dr. Mabry now for a response. Eric?
I'm here. Sorry, getting set up. Good. Can you see me? Okay. Yeah, great. All right. Well, it is a joy and privilege to respond to this paper. I would like to just begin initially with praise. It is a rare paper that is able to see the latent and rich potential within an interlocutor, and yet also recognize some impediments to the realization of that full potential. And so I'm grateful that, in a way, I find that your paper seems to be, despite its critiques, sort of oriented to liberation, right? How do we sort of liberate the rich potential here and what Balthasar is trying to do, especially vis-a-vis dualism, both of a Neoplatonic and I would think also a Cartesian variety as well. How do we liberate this sort of positive, as you called it, sort of Christian composite anthropology that's there, but is being literally truncated by some and laboring under intense oversights. Not many papers can both affirm potential and then also liberate the potential. And so I just want to begin with that. I think that's fabulous. However, we do have this tension, which I take it to be sort of the central axis of the critique. And that is that the primary impediment to the liberation of this potential is that Balthasar's appropriation of the spiritual senses is impeded by the use, or we'll say implicit function of normate stereotypes. Okay. So I have two main questions for the paper, and then what I hope to do is take your constructive proposal about how to liberate Balthasar's own proposal, and I want to use that as a springboard to sort of offer what I hope might be a disability positive ally for this project, as I'm calling it, of liberation that you've initiated vis-a-vis Balthasar. So my first question for the paper is, what exactly, and you alluded to this in some of your sources, and I was really, really deeply moved by the story about the way in which the woman you mentioned was able to use the Venus statue. I immediately went and looked it up, and I was overwhelmed by what a powerful thing that was. So my first question is, especially given that this is the International Institute for Method in Theology, what is the epistemological source of normate stereotypes? It seems that in one sort of kind of terrifying sense, that the abstractive and the speculative character of human knowing itself could be, and I'm open to this, could be inherently subject to ableist co-option. Okay, so like our own natural abstraction that functions in human knowing is perhaps inherently subject to ableist co-option. And if not inherent, which I hope it's not that, but if not inherent, then what is it exactly about either faculty psychology or intentionality analysis, both of the Lonerganian and phenomenological variety? So either faculty or intentionality-based epistemologies, what is it about them that makes them so susceptible to ableist abuse? So that's my first question for the paper. My second question is an interpretive one, and I just wonder if McElroy's interpretation of Balthasar on the spiritual senses is correct. Or to maybe put it a slightly different way, is the one-for-one interpretation of the spiritual senses that he attributes to Balthasar actually reflective in the tradition? And I take it, based on your use especially of Maximus and your allusions to Origen, that your answer is actually no. And it seems to me that at least in out of the three different origins for the spiritual senses tradition that Balthasar gives in Glory of the Lord, So he gives the origin tradition, which Maximus is going to be following. Then he gives it's not quite an Augustinian trajectory, but I would say it's actually a Cistercian sort of trajectory. So William of St. Thierry, then into Bonaventure and William of Auxerre. So at least in the case of William of Auxerre, interestingly enough, William of Auxerre's interpretation of the spiritual senses is that they're not bodily at all. They're actually a function or a perfection of the glorified soul. And so it's really a matter of interiority, not exteriority, that seems to be operative in the Western medieval trajectory. And while I do not judge myself to be an expert on Origen or Origen on the spiritual senses at all, on the few texts that I have examined in Origen, it seems to me that in Origen as well, it's not really clear to me that he elides or reduces the spiritual senses to the bodily senses. So this alternate reading of the tradition on spiritual senses, it seems to me, offers a potentially non-normate approach to senses because it does not presume, it doesn't presume 5 bodily senses as necessary for the realization of the spiritual senses. If that's true, it may, however, be subject once again to the very thing that von Balthasar is trying to overcome, and that is this dualism. So I would just welcome, as my second question, I'd like to hear more about your take on the actual patristic resources that you alluded to in your paper, but didn't have the opportunity maybe to sort of flesh out it as fully as I know that you would have liked to have done. So I just want to have that as an opportunity. Okay. Now, as I take it, your constructive proposal, or what I'm calling your liberative proposal, is toward the end of your paper, where you note, if the spiritual senses are not operationally attached to normate stereotypes and work not in a one-to-one relationship with individual physical senses, but instead within a collective sensate body, Balthasar's articulation of spiritual senses could welcome a more variable aesthetic theory. So taking that as a springboard, I'd like to raise a final question that maybe what you've identified as an impediment in Balthasar may actually be something, based on my first question about the epistemological origins of this problem, may be something that cuts very deeply even into patristic sources. And it seems to me, for example, in the case of Maximus the Confessor, if we were to look at, say, Opusculum 1, where we see a very, very ensconced faculty psychology, or in Opusculum 6, when he's dealing with Gethsemane, we still see that commitment to a faculty psychology. And same thing with the Cappadocians, same thing with Origen and, say, Periarchon. So we have this kind of object-oriented and therefore temptation, I think, to objectification that maybe means that the tradition as a whole, wherever it appropriates either an intentionality-based or a faculty psychology-based epistemology, would be subject to the specter of ableism. If that's true, then what I'd like to suggest as a companion is Michel Henry's critique of phenomenology as maybe a way to account for this potential threat in traditional Christian epistemology that seems to always kind of have itself open to being co-opted, as I said earlier, to ableism. And what Michel Henry suggests is that classical phenomenology overprivileges the visible. It overprivileges objectification. It overprivileges only one mode of appearing, and that is the mode of appearing that is intentionality. And he suggests instead that there's actually 2 modes of appearing, and he plays a lot with sort of the Greek ambiguity, which you know better than most, between appearing, manifestation, and revelation. And so I think he seems to suggest that even in Christian idioms that are sort of co-opted by this lacuna, that even our account of revelation could be subject to distortion because we're privileging this mode of appearing that's basic to the world. And what he suggests instead is that we need to take a closer look at incarnation, that we need to take a closer look not just at embodiment, but at flesh. And consequently, he says what we should prioritize is not knowledge, not even sensation, but life. Indeed, affectivity. And by affectivity, he means not any of the five senses, but the very condition of possibility for undergoing. Indeed, I think you could say, without violence to him, the condition of possibility for vulnerability. That vulnerability has an ontological foundation in our affectivity. But that's not just a creaturely condition for him. There is, in fact, an archi-passibility in God himself. And here I think there's this same element in the fathers as well. And so, as you know, Origen talks about in his homilies on Ezekiel, the passio caritatis, the passion of charity that motivates the incarnation. And we see that in other people, as you and I have talked about, like in Athanasius, etc. And so it seems to me that this divine love, this divine affectivity, this divine vulnerability can become a new kind of exemplar for our epistemology that helps bring into balance. I mean, we can't get out of our intentionality, but we can bring it back into orbit with an epistemology that doesn't unduly privilege ableist approaches or find itself subject to ableist problems. And there's a passage from Origen's Song of Songs commentary where he's talking about the spiritual senses. And he says that each of the senses must be identified with Christ. Be one with Christ. And then he goes on to talk about the senses on the side of the object. But then he comes back to the side of the subject. And what it seems to me becomes clear is that the Christological form that Origen grasps is the Christological form that is interior. And I think in some anticipation of where Brian's going to go later today, I think the connection between your paper and his is in fact a latent theology of the invisible mission of the Word. Christ transforms us not by changing the objects of our powers, but by transforming our subjectivity, our interiority from within. So again, I just want to thank you for an amazing, enjoyable paper, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, this privilege, actually, to respond and think with you about this tradition.
Thanks very much for that great response, Eric. Katherine, do you want to say a few words in response to Eric before opening up? Okay, go ahead.
So Eric, thank you so much. We are on similar wavelengths when it comes to the precarious position of knowledge. And in the larger paper argument that I planned for this conversation, I want to kind of articulate something that McEnroy identifies as like a fracture line. So he identifies, and he calls them almost exactly what you call them, this sort of Maximian strain and this more Augustinian strain. And then, of course, there are more citations within those two groups that kind of manifest. But what's interesting for me, seeing this from a more patristic angle, is that what Maximus actually represents in terms of knowledge production is, in terms of the Christian timeline, extremely unique. He occupies the space in which the church, for the first time, is utilizing the word doxa not as sensate knowledge, but now as glory. So now, whereas previously for Aristotle and other Greek philosophical traditions, doxa was the first rung of sensate knowledge, what's happened in Maximus is that there is this Johannine interplay where the thing that we thought was common is actually the glory of God. So what's happening there is that glory in Maximus is not as straightforward as Balthasar takes it to be. It's actually a subversion of what we expect knowledge production to look like. We expect there to be higher forms of knowledge that surpass the sensate. So whenever he's picking up on those strains in Maximus, you know, obviously he's not intending to do violence to the idea of the sensate by having these normate structures. But what he's actually doing is reaffirming a more collectively normate sense of how we come to know, how we come to perceive, and that the senses operate on a lower level. So even though he's trying to integrate the spiritual senses into the material senses in a real way, you know, that real authentic body kind of way, he's also not really understanding that he's picking up on a strain that is historically robust. And he could just, you know, if we could just tilt his orientation slightly more toward the east, we could then create a kind of nexus of physical and spiritual experience that doesn't really have a hard boundary line, right? Which is what you're picking up on in that more medieval kind of Western articulation of the sensate. We're assuming that Bonaventure is talking about the world of the sensate knowledge dropping out. Is that textually accurate, right? Is that textually what he means? We're assuming that through a very early modern lens of the retrieval of Aristotelian hierarchy. But then that also calls into question, do we have Aristotle right? We're reading all of this as a strict, rigid hierarchy where the body falls away. And we're also, like, within the Western Christian tradition, you know, Origen is indicted for this souls falling into bodies thing. You know, I would argue, like John Baer has recently argued, that is a misapplication of that hierarchical form of knowledge. And so what that means, right, is that the operational structure of how the physical world and the spiritual world interact can't be one-to-one. We don't actually know its inner workings. It's kind of caught up in mystery. It's what Maximus calls he calls the human being the microcosm of the universe. We are intimately interwoven with Christ in this way that is not necessarily, like, it doesn't follow a certain structure the way that Balthasar makes it follow, right? So spiritual sight might not correspond to physical sight, right? It's not that it obliterates physical sight, but it could be suprasensory rather than as a replacement. So I'm completely tracking with your comments, because that's exactly the kind of place we could go to further habilitate Balthasar's understanding of knowledge, so that we form that through line. So where we have the sensate and the spiritual that are actually interwoven in the way that he wants them to be, to overcome the stereotyping, we would then not create a one-to-one rigid hierarchical understanding of how physical and spiritual senses interact, and instead kind of go toward a maybe lost or underrepresented epistemology there. And then, you know, when you're asking questions of the epistemological source for normate stereotypes, ironically, I think it's Aristotle, right? So where he is, like so many, solving for the Neoplatonic with the Aristotelian, that obligates him to a certain hierarchical understanding of sense perception. Whereas if instead he leaned more into Maximus rather than into the Aristotelian strain, he could overcome that. And I think overcome it in a way that's more cogent to his overall theological construction. So I think I should cut myself off there, because I think you can tell I could wax poetic forever about this stuff. But thank you so much for the opportunity, and Eric, thank you so much for an excellent feedback.
With that, then, we still have some time, so we can open it up to our participants. Are there any questions? Oh, Anne, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your paper. So can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. Let me first confess that it has been my life's work to read Balthasar a lot and to provide a sympathetic understanding of him. I must confess my bias, which is Balthasar. And so I'm gonna further confess that I don't agree with your read of Balthasar. But instead of focusing on my disagreement, I thought of a few places where your, I think, legitimate desire for a better body from Balthasar might appear. So, for example, in Glory of the Lord, where he begins to discuss the spiritual senses, he also discusses John Henry Newman's illative sense and the taste of Christ for the Father. So he's already discussing a sensorium that's spiritualized in as much as it's yearned for. And this has its ultimate shape on the cross, where we see the Christ form, Jesus's body, broken, obliterated, even to the point of enduring passivity in hell. And so I wonder at the body Balthasar supposedly imagines when he sees Christ in this way. Since it seems to me that complicates the narrative that he's simply normate. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about that. P.S. On the cross, he also describes Christ as blind and unknowing, and that's not bad, actually. All right, I confess my position. Thank you so much for your paper.
Okay, unmuted myself. I think to respond to that, we would have to have a conversation about the different structures at play when we're discussing incarnation. And what's interesting to me about the large conversation about how Balthasar interacts with Maximus is that there's a large Western assumption that when both figures are discussing incarnation, they're discussing the same thing. So Maximus's incarnation is creation. It's not the moment of the nativity where Jesus is revealed as an infant. And so what this does is further open up the kind of expansiveness of what incarnation entails. So in that way, we would not be obligated to the physical experiences of Christ's material body, because Christ's creative action is implicated in the creation of all bodies. And in that way, bodies figure him, to pull from Origen. Christ as the archetype, if Christ as the archetype is located not on the cross, but instead at the moment of creation, then that is a further inclusion of Christ as blind, Christ as any human experience. Where I find this to be most provocative is in conversation with Nancy Easland's book, The Disabled God. She does the same Western organization for incarnation. And so she's obligated to locate Christ's disabled body on the cross. I'm very nervous about Christ's disabled body being incarnated in a secondary way. So all other attributes for her are incarnated through birth. His is incarnated through torture. I'm very uncomfortable with that, because I think it positions disability in an already secondary space. I would like to play with the idea of positioning Christ's disability at the moment of creation. And Eric sort of picked up on the theme that my broader work amplifies, which is the theme of Christ's own passibility. And passibility in an Origen context, and Maximus and Athanasius, and in the original Christological controversies, isn't just the capacity to suffer, it's the capacity to feel any emotion whatsoever. So it's this contingent vulnerability. And the fact that Christ experiences that contingent vulnerability in a way that isn't located necessarily in the nativity, but is located at the moment of creating human beings, right? The moment of creating human beings figures that possibility. That does very interesting things for what we mean by archetypical bodies, right? If Christ as an archetype it's not the cross, and it's not that it's not also inclusive of the cross, but it's not restricted to that moment of a physically broken or non-whole body. It locating at the creation of the human being and the inherent contingency, vulnerability, genetic latency, that kind of opens us up to a more, in my opinion at least, more robust understanding of what bodies can figure. So I think I definitely hear what you're saying about that theme within Balthasar. And I think my intention is to kind of amplify that possibility by leaning him more toward Maximus and these other kind of negative, more stereotypical descriptions of blindness, deafness, muteness, etc.
Thank you. We have time for one. Anne, did you want to say something? Or I just saw you pop
No,
back. Yeah, go ahead.
Fine. No.
Okay. We have time for one more question, if it's a quick question for Katherine. Yeah, Chris, please go ahead.
I don't want to take this in a whole different direction, but I get into some work with like near-death experience, and I know that this Father Robert Spitzer out at the Magis Institute, who is blind himself, actually does a lot of work with this near-death experience, and he finds some of the, I mean, he even gets to the point of saying like some of the near-death experience talk is like gets to the idea of like the sixth proof of an existence of God. But he talks about a lot how like the most fascinating ones are those who are like blind people who have near-death experience, who then have these manifestations of sight, and that like that, especially those who are blind the whole time. So I'm not sure if that would be even like a more of a physicalist argument, or kind of like, but like that would contribute, or have you thought about that, or how that actually like to bring in actually evidence that like that there are these manifestations of the spiritual senses, that even if the physical senses are disrupted in some kind, that there can be this application.
Yeah, I definitely have. I've definitely also, what I think, see a trace history in some of the patristic source material of similar experiences. So, you know, Pseudo-Dionysius is always the one who's implicated as being super Neoplatonic. I think that's wrong. And he has this absolutely gorgeous description of what I think is disability when he's talking about beingness. So he locates kind of disability and ability along this kind of, you know, sliding scale spectrum, right? If sight is lost physically, often people will talk about how their hearing is amplified, or their sense of touch or taste is amplified, because the body compensates for that lack of ability. And so in one way, you know, it's disability as defined by a lack of an ability, disability. But in other ways, there are amplified abilities. And so that's like supra able, right? And now what's interesting about this is that I don't think that Pseudo-Dionysius perceives of those lacks or losses as losses, because they're just sort of a reconfiguration of human potential. So when he describes being, he talks about the space beyond words, where we blink, where we breathe, where, you know, our sense of touch sort of resonates. And this is the space where he locates, like, this is our beingness, because he said that Christ is the one who's sort of on a cellular level creating that sensation. When we resonate with something, when I hear something and it activates something in me, he imagines that to be Christ's own energy kind of, you know, resonating and moving within me, and that is applicable to anyone if they breathe or exist. And he's viewing beingness as very literal, right? Our literal existence and continuation. And so I think that there's something really provocative there about recognizing different disabled experiences as structural lacks that could be compensated for a structural change. People talk about disablement in that way. So the deaf community is pretty famous for saying that deafness is not a disability, but instead it's a language barrier. And that if everyone were to be fluent in sign language, that would be a linguistic overcoming of a barrier rather than like a disability. And then, so that's like a community that's quite famous for reconfiguring what disability even means. I think the same thing can be true in examples that kind of exceed our expectations, like near-death experiences, or where people expected to feel like they encountered a tragedy by acquiring a disability, but instead what manifested in their lives was a kind of opening up to their own creative, like internal world. That people talk about this experience of disability was the best thing that ever happened to me, and it introduced me into another world of understanding my own identity. I think that that's also kind of where I see those pieces fitting together.
Thanks very much for your questions, and thank you very much, Katherine, for your paper. And equally, thank you, Eric, for your response. We can now take a break because we're going to start in about 10 minutes.